Welcome everyone to a very exciting session here in Google Hangouts. We're at the Sustainable Energy for All conference in New York, and I have a fabulous group of panelists here with me. So I have Jiang from UGEI. We have Mitra Ardron from Limited Networks. We have Thomas Duveau from Mobisol. And online, we have Robert Freeling from Self, who will be joining us at some point. Unfortunately, he couldn't be here with us in New York. We have a fantastic topic, which is how do we double the share of renewables by 2030? And what we're going to do to start out is I'm going to ask each of the panelists to give us a very short description of their organization so that you have a little bit of a sense of the context that we're coming at things from here. And then we're going to go into some of the challenges, some of the successes, and what our panelists see as the drivers for scaling over the next 15 years. So let's start with Jiang. Tell us a little bit about UGEI.
Sure, thank you. And good morning or afternoon, everyone. My name is Jiang. I'm the CEO of UGEI. So what we do as a company is we offer distributed renewable energy solutions to primarily commercial and industrial customers throughout the world. So what I mean by that is we provide the full gamut of the solution from the design upfront to the procurement of the various equipment. In addition, we'll provide, with our partners on site, installation, ongoing maintenance, and monitoring. Increasingly, we're working with third parties to provide financing as well for these solutions so that it's a little bit easier for the commercial customers to purchase these solutions and projects with us. We are all over the world. We have a distribution network all over the world, but we focus on a couple of core markets, the Philippines, Panama, and China. So we've done about 10 megawatts in total energy projects just in the past year and a half in these markets. And so seeing the growth up front, really excited to be in both in the industry and here to talk about some of the experiences and challenges that we've gone through.
Just before we go on to Mitra, tell us a little bit about the type of projects that you're involved in, the kind of size that we're talking about.
Sure. So we have two sales channels, one through our distribution network, and that's selling just equipment from wind turbines to batteries or solar. The other type, where we realize most of our growth and most of our projects, it's anywhere from 100 to 200 kilowatts all the way up to multi-megawatts in that range. We think that's a sweet spot for a lot of the distributed energy projects that we do with our customers, and that's where we see a lot of our growth coming from.
Fantastic, thanks so much. So now to Mitra Ardron of Limited Networks. Mitra, tell us a little bit about Limiter and what you're doing today.
Sure. So Limiter's in the business of removing the barriers to small-scale distributed energy going to scale. There are really three tightly interwoven aspects to what we do. The first part is hardware, like this chip, which I'm sure you can't see on the camera, that we integrate into solar home systems, and we have 3 manufacturers who have products on the market, and then several more who are about to announce that have this built into their technology. We also do mini-grid meters, both from AC and DC. So we're really across the scale of solutions once you get much above the solar mountain level. The second big thing we do is integrate into agent payment networks, and one of the biggest challenge is how do you get the money out of villages. So we integrate into payment networks. For example, we integrate into a top-up network in Peru, as an example. And also working in places where mobile money infrastructure is not that well distributed. So I mean, East Africa is very strong, but most of the rest of the world is not that strong. Right. And then the third part of what we do is we're in the process of creating a financing arm, a funding arm, to fund SMEs for the working capital they need for pay-as-you-go.
So you're talking about energy companies, you're financing energy companies.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
So what I should have said at the beginning is we're a big believer that for energy poverty to be dealt with at scale, you have to be working with local entrepreneurs who understand local markets. Those people generally don't have access to finance. how do you find them the working capital allows them to hold essentially a loan for the 2 years or so that the customer's paying?
Great, fantastic, thank you so much. And we'll come back and get some more details. And so, Thomas, tell us a little bit about Mobisol and again, where you are today.
So Mobisol essentially is a company that does one thing. We basically sell solar home systems to the rural population in East Africa. Solar home systems, it's in the name. It's basically, think of 90% of the population in rural Africa that doesn't have access to electricity, and that in our belief will not have access because the grid is not coming as quickly as it should maybe. So a solar home system does everything that a household needs in terms of electricity and does it now rather than waiting for a couple of years. When you look at the discussion about electrification and the challenge to basically bring 100% of the population or to bring access to energy to 100% of the population, most of the solutions until now were on-grid. So it's this large infrastructure, large central plants, which are basically thought about. And what is forgotten is that there is this whole off-grid electrification play, this rural electrification, our belief, and I think it's shared on this panel, will rather come through off-grid electrification than waiting for the grid. And that's, I think, a very important paradigm shift that with entrepreneurs has already happened. And I think that governments and financiers in particular need to hear this line as often as possible to basically adapt, because if we want to get this electrification challenge solved, it's not going to work without off-grid electrification. I think of it as a puzzle. You know, the puzzle has 100 pieces, that's 100% of electrification. The average currently in East Africa is about 15 to 20% of the population has electricity. So there's 80 to 85% which are up for grabs. And the question is, what strategies do you basically establish to make sure that these 85% are filled as quickly as possible? Part of it will be on-grid, and part of it, we believe, will be off-grid.
Fantastic. Okay, great. So we've set the stage. Oh, Robert, you're there. Fantastic to see you. Tell us a little bit about self. For me, you're one of the fathers and founders of the solar space. So it's very exciting to have you on the panel with us. But tell us what you're doing. Tell us a little bit about the history and what you're doing today. We have a technology challenge.
This isn't a financing challenge. We need to pay our bills.
Everyone talked about financing challenges and policy challenges earlier. So when we were discussing this prior to the panel, technology didn't come up, but maybe we need to discuss that in a little while. But I'd love you guys to go into a little bit more depth when you talk about the challenge of financing. Sort of precisely what do you mean? When you're talking about the challenge of policy issues, what do you mean specifically that you're facing, each of you? Because you're all at slightly different stages of development, and I think that we'll probably see some interesting different nuances as things come out. So maybe we'll go the other way. We'll start with you, Tomas, and get some of your thoughts on those 2 points, and then any other challenges that you see as relevant that are kind of blocking this movement of doubling access to renewables?
I'm going to start by saying that the 3 major elements of the business model of Mobisol is basically we provide microcredit with the product, because nobody has, say, on average $800 for a Mobisol system basically lying around. So you need to pre-finance the system. So financing is one of the challenges that I think we all face. The second one is the payment of Mobisol system can only be done through mobile payment. What Mitra actually said is very prevalent in East Africa. So how do you deal with the mobile network operators who maybe they're not energy companies, so they haven't quite gotten their head around the potential of electrification in East Africa? And the third one is we offer a 48-hour intervention service, so basically a 3-year warranty, and within 48 hours we will intervene and solve a problem if there is a problem. So maintaining a high quality of service in the last mile in rural Africa can be a challenge. That's the 3 challenges. The one you were asking is basically this meta challenge of the policy issue. And in my view, and we're working in 2 different countries, Tanzania and Rwanda. In Tanzania, there is no electrification strategy which is putting off-grid near the center of the solution. So there's no regulation of a market because it's not perceived as a market. So a lack of regulation can also be a policy issue.
Exactly.
Because you don't find the type of standards that maybe investors would want to see in place before actually taking the risk in a country which is already perceived as a high risk. And then you see not the opposite, but another way to deal with it is basically to have an integrated electrification strategy, as in Rwanda. And in Rwanda, it's written down in a basic strategy book or paper. So electrification, what is it, economic development and poverty reduction strategy version 2, which has an energy chapter. And there it very specifically says we're going to do part of our electrification with off-grid, namely solar home systems, and part of it with on-grid, which means that since it's a message which is coming from directly the President's office, we will have the regulatory authorities and bodies working on actually making sure that all the regulation and policies are in place to make that happen. And they really work very closely with KPIs, and it's a very transparent way of actually getting to a goal. So, as a recommendation, and I tried to make the point this morning with the panel with the financiers, where there is make sure that you have some kind of a programmatic approach to electrification, and that all these different people that need to work together, which is basically entrepreneurs and financiers and regulators and so on, actually work together on making something which is potentially and theoretically and practically possible really happen.
Fantastic. Maybe we'll go to you, Mitra. What are some of the challenges you see on either the points that Thomas raised or some of the things you were discussing earlier, or other points that you have in mind?
Well, obviously, as a B2B company, there are really two sets of barriers. There's the barriers we face, and there's the barriers that our customers, who are energy companies, are themselves facing. And they kind of fit into three kind of buckets. The first bucket, of course, is finance. We created this SEAL fund, Scalable Energy Access Loans, because if you're an energy entrepreneur in country and you're trying to raise somewhere between $50,000 to $500,000, there's no one that will do it with you.
Right.
You're too small for the
Exactly.
impact funders. You're too big for the local banks. Local banks want, the collateral, which is an entrepreneur, young entrepreneur, you probably don't have. There's really nobody financing that, and suddenly the finance needs have gone from borrowing money to cover 3 to 6 months while you buy stuff and import it to borrowing stuff to cover 2 years while our customers paying off. So debt to equity, if the lender uses the concept of debt to equity ratio, they're not going to lend to you. Even though your business is just as viable as it was 3 months ago, it's actually more viable. Then suddenly you don't meet their metrics. So that's a big issue for us. Obviously, funding for your stuff has been an issue. We're raising another round now. We've raised some money in the past. There's like the entrepreneurs in country, there's a dearth of capital as you grow out of the angel funded stage, and again up to the point where impact funders start looking at you, which is multi-millions. So it's easy to raise angel money in this space because everyone loves what we're doing. It's very hard to get the working capital that takes you from a few $100,000.
I think that's an interesting point. I think it may be easy if you're a West Coast-based company, but it might be very difficult if you're a Kenyan-based company. And I think the other thing that's very difficult is to raise local capital. So if you want to raise money in rupees, or if you want to raise money in Kenyan shillings, or that's a challenge. So I think that it's actually quite an interesting point. Jiang, what about you? What thoughts do you have on this issue of challenges?
Sure. And I think challenges we face might be a little bit different because last year we had about 5 million in revenue already. So we're actually facing the challenge of two things: working capital, like you said, but going from 5 million growing to 15, 20 million. And because it's a working capital intensive industry where you're buying, you're importing, and we're working with local partners to support their businesses in terms of helping us do the local installations. That is a challenge for us, just on a slightly different scale. And then I would say the other financing challenge is post-installation, where who's going to own those systems. I would say our challenges are slightly different because we work with slightly bigger businesses. I think that's one of the things we gravitated towards in order to grow the business and to grow our business. And so we've partially solved the latter issue, for example, in the Philippines and Panama, by working with local banks who are much more familiar with the customers that we're working with. They might have family collateral, or have worked with these guys for a long time, so they don't quite need as much diligence as an outside American fund or impact fund might need to do. And so in the Philippines, we've set up loan programs with several banks where they are able to go through the process of basically figuring out if they can lease our systems to a customer in a relatively short amount of time, typically because they're already customers, either through retail or through commercial. And then pre is, again, where we're facing a lot of issues. We've raised private capital ourselves. We've actually raised a working capital fund ourselves, but as we grow from a base of relatively small 3 to 5 million in revenue to 15, 20, like I said, it's working capital intensive, and so it's very difficult to get that capital in order to fund that growth, even though we have those confirmed contracts.
Right.
And then I would say on the policy side, might be a little bit different for us as well, since it seems like you guys are a little bit more focused on the residential or markets where it's a little bit earlier stage, whereas for us it's a lot of, okay, well, if we're going to do this megawatt system, what permits do we need?
Right.
Because for a 1 megawatt system versus a 10 kilowatt system, it's very different.
Right.
And for a lot of these countries who are adopting these things, it's a little bit unclear, and so you end up spending a lot of time, one, trying to find the right resource to talk to, and then figuring out how to pay for it, and to make sure that you're getting your money, you're getting a good return on your investment.
Right. Well, and I imagine enforcement of contracts becomes an issue. So just basically doing business, the kind of basic conditions for doing business. Can we check to see whether Robert is with us? Is he able to talk now? Still not?
Can you guys hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you. Yay! So tell us about self, and in the process, tell us about some of your challenges other than the technology challenge of being able to speak to us on the panel.
I apologize for that. So as I was saying, Self has been around for a while, founded in 1990. Our initial focus was solar home lighting systems and using microcredit as a way of enabling families to pay for these systems, and that eventually paved the way for Selco to be launched, which I'm sure all of you are very familiar with Harish Handy and the great work that Selco has done in India. And it was one of the early examples of how a solar energy company could provide a service on a cost recovery basis and grow as a business. Since Selco was launched, our focus has sort of broadened to look at ways in which we can bring value not just to individual homes but entire communities. So we started to experiment starting about 15 years ago with larger systems for schools and health clinics and water pumping systems and small businesses, wireless communications. Eventually we put together what we refer to as the whole village development model. So essentially the idea is to go in wherever possible and address a multiplicity of needs at the same time. That, of course, is starting to sort of be brought under the umbrella of microgrids, because by definition a microgrid does address the needs of a whole community. So we're at least the kind of microgrids that we're interested in pursuing, with larger amounts of power that will not just light individual homes but provide power for larger customers in a community. And we're starting our first microgrids in Haiti and in Colombia, and are excited about continuing along the microgrid path. The last few years we have carved out a somewhat unique niche in the area of food security. We've been working in West Benin, combining solar water pumping with drip irrigation to enable women farmers to grow food during the dry season. This has historically been a very challenging period for the folks in northern Benin, where the lack of rainfall severely impedes their ability to grow food and eat nutritious food. And now, thanks to solar water pumping and drip irrigation, these women farmers that we're working with have been growing high-value fruits and vegetables year-round. So there's been a very dramatic improvement in their own health and nutrition, and they're also earning income, which has implications for their health and education. So we're excited because this model is addressing not only access to energy, but water and food, women's empowerment, income generation, all at the same time. And we've now expanded what we call the solar market garden to 10 villages in Benin. and have even replicated in a couple of places in Haiti. So we're pretty excited about that. The problem is the high upfront cost. Like many other applications of PV, you're dealing with an upfront cost, which is often prohibitive if they have to pay cash. So we're struggling with ways to to finance these larger systems. This is not an individual solar drip system for a family. These are cooperatives, 35 women tending to half-hectare or larger 1 hectare plots of land. So the investment is quite significant.
Fantastic, thank you. I know, Thomas, you wanted to say something when Jiang was speaking earlier, and maybe also to something that Robert was saying.
Well, coming to your point, Robert, of basically solving this financing issue, which is basically pre-financing systems which do more than light. One of the beliefs of Mobisol is really electrification is more than 3 lights. And it's at the household level, if you give people the possibility to earn money, i.e. to recharge mobile phones, solar lanterns, village cinemas, whatever, what we see, we have a repayment rate of 100% of these customers. Why? Because their ability to generate income is higher than the price of the product. Mm-hmm. So then I basically have on my balance sheet, I have this big position which is receivables, but I can prove that I have a 100% repayment rate. Mm-hmm. The point I'm trying to make is data. And since we're on a Google Hangout, we might mention data. Mm-hmm. Data is important, not as gathering data for itself, but it's on the one hand side we need the technical availability of the system, so technical status, and we need almost like a real-time description of the receivables quality. And we solve that by putting a SIM card in every single system. So we're moving up the value chain just as you did, to work with farmers to make sure that we understand how we basically can create, how the systems can create value and incremental income generation faster for either small businesses or families. If you can show this data in real time to a financier, he can suddenly look at you as a receivables financing date.
Exactly.
And you become bankable because with what Mitra was saying before, Mobisol's been in the business for 4 years now, and we're profitable. So we're making money already after 3 years in an acknowledged, difficult environment. But if you can prove that the perceived risk is actually much higher than the real risk, that's at least a foot in the door when it comes to financing. And that's, I think something I'm even happy to discuss, after the session. But it seems to work wonders to actually give financiers an access to their investment, which looks very much like what they did before. So think of the infrastructure funds that are basically around. They think of project finance, they like off-balance sheet type of things. A company or an institution financing microfinance institutions will want to see very similar KPIs.
Absolutely.
And when you look at the companies of the likes of Mobisol, I'm part of what I do is an MFI play.
Yeah.
But I'm much cheaper because I work only online. So in terms of cost of dollar lent, suddenly, although that was never the original idea, mm-hmm. I compete with MFIs when it comes to tapping into large, basically buckets of money. And that's why I think data on almost like a daily or even better real-time basis that allows you to do portfolio risk and the likes of analysis is crucial to actually get these investors on board that will not basically engage into that market if you don't give them if we don't look like the normal investor.
I think that's a really interesting point. I just want to, I think we've moved now into the conversation about drivers to scale. Like how do we really double the share of renewable energy? And I'm going to ask each of you to chip in on that point. But what I want to do is frame it in a different way, which is there's doubling the number of people. So that's one way of doubling. There's doubling the installed capacity, which is another way of doubling. And then there's doubling the number of people who have more high quality access to energy. So kind of this idea of moving up the energy ladder. And I know you all have very interesting thoughts on different parts of that. So let me throw it out there. You were dying to say something, Mitra, so why don't you go next, sure. And then we'll go to Jiang and come back to Thomas, and we'll bring in Robert to sort of close out that sort of thought.
Well, I would echo something that Thomas has said, really, is that de-risking the customer loan is key to accessing the investment. And de-risking the customer loan is about giving a window onto the payments and the processes that are going on. So you can, as an investor, you can see what's going on. You can see, oh, this loan is late being repaid because the customers are late repaying, and all the customers are late repaying because maybe the crop's coming late. Well, that's not actually a default situation.
Yeah.
That's a situation which means, okay, in a month's time, the crop's going to come in, and everyone's going to make up their back payments because they don't want to lose their electricity system. If we treat that as a default or a bad loan, we're in the process of actually separating out what are risky problems from what are normal fluctuations that we're expected to see when people are cut the cap. So I think, yeah, using technology to enable low-cost loans, I think it's key. I think also related to that, as Thomas mentioned, is MFIs. MFIs have totally failed, with a few notable exceptions, to step up to energy loans. If you don't like the loans,
I totally disagree with you.
That's
So that's a separate conversation.
because the loans, I mean, I've been at multiple conferences where most of the MFIs don't get it because they need to make loans that are larger than they want to make. Well, the customer loans are too big, so too small for them, and the business loans are too small for them, so too big for them. So they don't fit in properly. And the other challenge is the cost of lending of these MFIs is so high, and that goes on the cost of the product. Whereas if you're working with an energy entrepreneur who already has to have a relationship with the customer, and if the pay-as-you-go is enabling them to keep track of the payments, you don't need to add somebody else in there who's having someone go around and knock on the door once a week to collect payments. And removing that cost takes it from being a 20% overhead to being a 10% overhead, and that is crucial to making this stuff affordable.
And 100% agreement. Sorry to basically, we're kind of working against you, but I've talked to 9 MFIs in Tanzania, and all of them are basically ignoring the fact that there is a game in off-grid electrification, and the main reason is MFIs work in urban and peri-urban environments. We work in rural environments, and MFIs have no clue about the customer. They have no information about the customer, which is why they're asking these ludicrously high interest rates, which basically would take away the business. So it simply doesn't work. And we've even tried to give our software solution, which basically would decrease the cost of dollar lend by 80% to an MFI to say, let's do a private project. And they didn't accept it, simply because it was, and the argument was, I have 450 people collecting money, like offline with a suitcase. With your system, I would have only 100 employees. I don't want it. That's the kind of thing.
We can spend the entire time talking about microfinance, which I don't want to do, as fascinating as it would be to me, because I think actually, one of the companies that really kind of spearheaded this movement is Renewable, which is an MFI-based organization. So I think that there's very interesting stories. SKDRP has sold, over 500,000 units. I think there are a lot of microfinance organizations that are successful. So I think that, let's not bog down the conversation on whether MFIs are the right vehicle or not, because you guys are fabulous. And I think my view is that there's space for everyone. If we're going to really double, everyone has to be playing and everyone needs to be moving forward. But Jiang, what are some of your thoughts on really how do we reach this? Like, what's some of the drivers that you see out there that are going to get us to that space, other than investing hugely in Mitra and Mobisol, which is clearly one of the options?
Yeah, I mean, one of the interesting things that I'm hearing from the panel is how do you de-risk the loans? I think we've, as a company, approached it a little bit differently because we're working with customers who are large enough to have access to some bank financing, and so we leverage both our Western brand, UGEI brand, as well as the bank's local knowledge of their customers to be able to offer this type of financing, which applies a little bit better to the type of systems we're doing because they're a little bit bigger. I think one of the things we focus on in order to scale and to grow quickly is by focusing on commercial and industrial customers who have a lot of capacity. So, some guy might have 20 factories in China or whatever, some 10 buildings in the Philippines, and they don't know about the system. They've never really done this type of financing. It's a little bit risky for them. And so we tend to do one project to make sure that they're comfortable with the process, which I think also is something that can be very key. How do you make the process short, easy? I think that Solar City did a great job of here. And then being able to do that and then scale it all the way up across 10 different buildings, 20 different manufacturing sites, things like that. So that's what we're focused on in our core development markets to do one project with a customer. For example, in Panama, we are doing 3 or 4 stores. They have 20.
Right.
So once we're successful in doing those 4 stores, within I think the next year and a half, we can quadruple, double the amount of capacity that's installed with very little additional cost to customer acquisition time. And so that's something that we as a company is focused on in order to achieve the capacity installed goals that we have.
Yeah, thank you. Mitra, before this session, you and I were talking about one of the interesting trends that you had noticed, which is a movement towards solar home systems, at least in terms of Lumita's businesses and sort of business models. And I wondered if you could sort of explain a little bit more about that and whether you see that as a trend and whether you think that that kind of trend is going to be a driver for scale moving forward.
Yeah, so I mean, we work across the whole spectrum from small home systems of 6 watts all the way up to mini grids, and we're seeing a massive trend over the last year or two. We've seen that of people moving away from both lanterns and mini grids to solar home systems for 2 very different reasons. And obviously, the main driver is the cost of solar is coming down.
Right.
And so what we're seeing is that customers are coming to us saying, we were previously selling solar lanterns, maybe $20 to $30, even as low as $10 a unit. But those customers really want multiple lights and potentially more.
Right.
They don't have cash for doing that. The systems are now cheap enough that you can sell it on a 2-year loan at less than the price they were paying for a kerosene lamp or a couple of kerosene lamps. So $2 a week for 100 weeks is $200. You can get a reasonable system for that. You spend $4 a week, you can get a much bigger than this. $8 a week, and you're up where to a Mobisol type statistic. Those are now totally viable financial pathways now as the systems have come down. So people want more than lanterns, and now they're willing to pay for it if they can pay for it over time.
Right.
The opposite trend is from the mini grid side is coming down. We hear a lot of talk about mini grid, especially at conferences on the East Coast, where it's donor funding and philanthropy funded. We get a lot of inquiries from mini grid companies, and we've done mini grid in Haiti with our meters and so on. We did ones in Peru and so on in Zambia. But we're not seeing that scaling because it's essentially being driven. There's 2 main reasons. One is it's being driven by philanthropy. So it only scales to the size of the philanthropy of CSR. I chaired the session on finance and mini grids in Bangalore 2 weeks ago, and nobody had a viable mini grid model of anything other than the basic lantern model. Unless they were subsidized by CSR money. There's nothing wrong with those subsidies, but they're not scaling to the billion people that need it. And the second problem is regulation. Governments are the biggest barrier to mini grids. Government put in tariff regulations that mean you can't sell power at the cost of producing it. They put in regulations on, for example, I think it's India that said that the grids have to be capable of connecting to the main grid, which is an accurate way of making sure that your grid is unaffordable by the people who have to pay for it today. Mm-hmm. And then they won't tell you when the grid's coming, which means that no one will invest in it, because who's going to invest in a project that's going to take 10 years to pay back if in 3 years into that or 5 years into that the grid's going to come and it's going to blow your business case.
Exactly.
So we're seeing it going to people. They forget mini grids. We'll do solar because we can actually do them. We can sell them. People will pay for them, and we can finance them. I'm sure Robert will disagree.
Yes, no, Robert. I would love to hear Robert's view. So on this issue of drivers to achieving this goal of doubling the share, obviously, Self with your whole village development model has a real mini grid kind of centered focus. So what do you think are some of the drivers, Robert?
Right. Well, first, we didn't used to. I mean, we
Have we lost Robert again?
Oh,
You're back.
You're
You're good.
back.
Yep.
You're back.
okay. Can you hear me now? Okay. It's just recently that we started looking at mini grids. Our approach to whole village electrification to date has really been to go in and install standalone PV systems for the school and the clinic and the water pumping system, and sort of take that technical approach. The idea was to address, you know, the village community needs, but we did so sort of with standalone separate systems. And in fact, that's one of the great strengths of photovoltaics as a technology is, you know, you can put them where you wish, and they can capture the photons where they fall and generate electricity. You don't necessarily need the grid. In fact, for a long time, it was not efficient. It was difficult to manage the flow of electricity. Now, though, with smart meters and you know, it's sophisticated inverter technology, you can do that quite efficiently. So it's changed the equation technologically with respect to mini grids. But to sort of echo your point, Mitra, that the greatest obstacle right now is, I would say, policy. We don't have very positive enabling environments around the world that will make it easy for the private sector to come in with civil society and work towards these larger solutions. So I would say, in terms of doubling, you know, the amount of people connected or the installed capacity, I'd say a critical factor really comes down in part to the political will of governments. I've seen examples of governments that have made, you know, decision to really put a focus on energy access, and it's amazing what you can do with the right kind of political will and commitment to doing so. There are isolated examples of countries that have made tremendous progress. When I started working in this field, Brazil had 35 million people without power. Most of the folks in Brazil have electricity now, with, of course, an exception of people that live in the Amazon. So I think going forward, you know, the extent to which governments can embrace SE4ALL objectives and put in place the kind of enabling environments that will attract the private sector along with civil society to come in and scale these solutions are going to have a huge impact on our ultimate success in reaching these goals. The other thing I would say is you know, we have a tremendous lack of knowledge in the world when it comes to what's possible, and also on the technical side, a lack of trained personnel. We've worked in Haiti since 2008, and we've trained a handful of people, you know, on our own team that can go and install these systems. But it's a drop in the bucket in terms of what is needed if Haiti is going to reach its somewhat ambitious goals for renewable energy. Fortunately, we've just been funded by the Norwegian government to design and put in place a national solar training center in Haiti, and that's very exciting. We see a huge need and an opportunity throughout the developing world and in sub-Saharan Africa, for instance, to really scale up the knowledge base of folks at all levels, you know, in the cities, but also in the rural areas, so that when these opportunities come to fruition, there are going to be people that can you know, be on hand to maintain.
Oh, did we lose Robert?
You lost me?
Oh, you're there. You're back. Okay, quick,
Okay.
finish that thought.
No, I'm just the need for scaling up human capacity at all levels is, I think, very important.
Yeah. So I know, Thomas, you wanted to chip in with something.
Yeah, we're talking about this C4ALL goal of doubling, and I think it's a very conservative goal, because if we double by 2030, the majority of electricity will still come from fossil fuels. So I think I'm much more a proponent of 100% renewable energy by 2030. It sounds, in Germany, I come from Germany, so in Germany that's a thing which has been proven 100 times and it's working and it's fine.
And you don't even have much sun there.
And it, you know, it works there, so if it works there, it will work in East Africa. And I think when you look at the government of Rwanda, for example, they're much more ambitious than anything that C4ALL is doing, because they're saying we will go from 17% electrification to 70% within 4 years. They're looking at 100% by 2020. And even if they reach 3/4 of their goal, and my guess would be that by 2020, most of the electricity in Rwanda will come from solar. And then you will have something which will be unseen in any industrial country, i.e. a majority of the kilowatt hours coming from solar. And I think that's the type of thing that we need to look at, and the kind of examples which can be inspiring to other countries. And one of the reasons I think, and that's almost like it's a semantic point, why are mini-grids so loved by donors and international institutions? They have the word grid. And in this whole shift of paradigms, I think because grid is still something you basically historically looked at, mini-grid sounds like it's not as bad as these decentralized solar home solutions, which can't be serious. When you look at what we do, we install, I don't know, 2 megawatt or something. It's infrastructure. It's long-term. We have a 10-year-long guarantee. So it essentially does what on-grid did. And I think that's part of this change of paradigm.
Shifting the mindset, exactly. So I think we've heard quite a few challenges which are external, and how, you know, if we were to overcome those external challenges, we might be able to reach this goal. But I wondered if any of you could reflect on challenges which are internal to a company, where if they resolve those kinds of internal challenges, then they're going to soar and scale more effectively. So rather than looking out and saying the problem's out there with all of you policymakers and all of you investors who aren't giving us money and, you know, et cetera, what can we do internally to change the way or what are the investments we need to make internally in order to be able to scale? Do any of you, you were actually mentioning some interesting things about that point, Jiang, earlier.
Sure, yeah, I can talk briefly about that. So about 2 years ago, UG didn't do too much financing. We were still a little bit too small to do that for the majority of our projects. And one of the things that I was brought on to do was to kick off our project financing as we got into some of these larger markets with slightly larger customers as well. So I think one of the things that's a challenge certainly is you talked about financial capital that's difficult to obtain. I think human capital also is a little bit difficult to obtain. Project financing can be very heavy in terms of legal, finance, and some of the other types of experiences that you need. And it's a little bit difficult to find people who are willing to take the risk to work in a smaller company to do that. And so I think our company's done a pretty good job of creating those types of processes and finding ways to work with local banks and other types of financiers where we can leverage some of their experience, some of my experience, to be able to create financing evaluation tools internally and processes internally and approvals internally, where we are hopefully building a process that we're able to evaluate a customer on a relatively quick basis, fast basis. But definitely that's something that I think is a challenge that we face as a company and that we'll continue to face as we scale. But something that if we solve, I think can have a kind of big impact.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you're going to enter the world of financing, you need to have proper finance people developing those skill sets. And actually, you did the similar thing in Mobisol. You ended up drawing a lot from people who had very solid microfinance backgrounds in terms of building your own systems internally. So you weren't engineers who suddenly got into finance. You actually pulled finance people in to be able to build that capacity internally, which seemed like a smart investment from my point of view.
Yes, so what we did, we basically hired people from the MFI industry to describe Mobisol in the KPIs and in the way that, you know, an investor would typically look at an MFI. And since obviously, you know, our rate of repayment is one of the major variables that's going to impact our profitability, we wanted to understand that. We're mostly engineers or generalists, so we bought that from outside. I think there's a risk actually to get only finance people to run companies like Mobisol. So we're not doing that yet because we're not a financially optimized company. We've never really looked at it in the sense of maximizing profit or whatever. And, you know, almost like we seem to be doing the right thing on the ground, and suddenly we're making a profit. And when you show a positive EBITDA, suddenly people who know much better what finance is all about and that trust your ability to deliver on the ground help you come up with finance backing. So most of what we did in terms of finance, we haven't invented. We've done it together with people who've trusted our ability to be an operationally excellent company on the ground, driven, doing things with love, and then the rest, you know, is coming. So yes, we need basically people to talk to our investors, but we will not and I think that's going to stay for the next couple of years. We're not going to be a financially optimized company. And I think in terms of keeping the spirit, that's very important, because if your CFO is the guy who's basically running the show, we wouldn't have all these excellent people on the board working 14 hours a day for relatively little salary, and that's something which is going to be the challenge going forward, when we will need to attract, next year it's already 30 to 40 million finance to do just what we need to do next year. So, it's something which is, so keeping the spirit, keeping this kind of, we know what we're doing, that's something which is going to be thrilling to see how we can keep that, because without that, it doesn't work. Scaling doesn't work.
Well, I know we have to end soon, so Mitra, I want to give you a chance to add anything that you want to add, and also Robert, and then we'll probably have to, unfortunately, end the session. I think we could all talk for hours.
Sure. So I'll just add to what Thomas was saying, that if we're going to not just have 100% renewable energy by 2030, but also get that last 1 billion electrified. Remember, there was 1 billion people back when Edison invented the light bulb. There were 1 billion people who didn't have electricity, and it's the same number now, 100 billion. 2030, I think, should be the target for everybody to have energy. So which means we need to be very vigorous about only looking at projects that have the potential to scale. We don't need any more pilot projects unless those pilot projects have the potential to replicate without that CSR grant. But the second one, grants and philanthropy have their place. We also need to be scaling very quickly. I was very involved in the early days of the internet, where we didn't talk in terms of growth, we talked in terms of doubling time. And that's what we need to be doing in this sector if we're going to hit 1 billion people by 2030. I mean, our doubling time is 3 months in terms of revenue. That's the kind of times we need to be seeing. 3 to 6 months, every entity in this space should be doubling. If you're going to grow that quickly, you need to build capacity internally, because you go from 2 people doing it to 10 people very quickly. And that means you need, in particular, investors who think in that term. Because if you're doing 6 months worth of due diligence on a company, that's not the same company. Or, sorry, put it this way. If the company is the same at the end of your due diligence process as it was at the beginning, you shouldn't be investing. Right? You need companies that can make fast and act at the same pace that we need to be 100% renewable energy for 100% of the world's population by 2030.
So on that note, Robert, do you have something you want to add? Your closing comments, hopefully we can hear you.
I'm a big believer in public-private partnerships. I think there's a role for the public sector that they need to be invested in supporting projects that may be financially sustainable, but there's a lot that goes along in terms of, for example, the work that we do. Maybe the solar pumps are financeable, but there's a lot of capacity building and training, and support that we provide as a nonprofit that a company wouldn't necessarily be willing to do. So I think that's where the public sector can step in and sort of fill a role where you've got both private capital flowing into these markets as well as more public sector support. So I think in the end, we need a combination of both public and private sector support to get to where we need to go.
Fantastic. So on that note, let me sum up some things that I've heard all of you say, which I think are fantastic. So to be able to double capacity by 2030, first of all, I'm hearing that you all think that's not ambitious enough. So that is just super exciting in and of itself. But in order to do it, we need to build capacity internally. Robert was talking about that. Jiang, you were talking about that in terms of technology, finance capacity, etc. The other kinds of key resources you need in an institution. Mitra, you also talked about that. Being agile, building on partnerships, as Robert was saying, being bankable, and having the right policy environment. Jiang, you also said that. And the other thing that I loved that I heard was Thomas's point is that it needs to be done with love. And with love, with love, we'll get there with love. Isn't that the Beatles song? All you need is love. So on that note, everyone, thank you so much for joining us. I'm Nikki Armacost of ArcFinance. We've had Thomas with Mobisol, Mitra with Lumiter, and Jiang with UGEI. And thank you all for being with us. hopefully we'll see some of you upstairs and the rest of you we'll see around the world somewhere or other. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.